Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North, and this the second part of the Dennis Nilsen episodes. If you haven't listened to the first part, please do so before proceeding with this one. In the previous episode, I delved into Nilsen's life prior to his first murder. While some killers are created from a moment of passion or anger, others, like Nilsen, are developed over months, even years. For Nilsen, it started with the alleged abuse he experienced at the hands of his grandfather and his feelings of being different. By his teens, he realised that he was attracted to men, but had to suppress his feelings until his late 20s, when he left the restrictive confines of the army and the police force. Unable to outwardly express his homosexuality during his formative years, Dennis developed elaborate fantasies and found he was more attracted to the passive form of an unconscious or sleeping individual, with him feeling he could possess and dominate them. Having moved to London in 1973, he had hoped that the capital, unlike his small Scottish hometown, could make him feel like he belonged. But the big city only added to his loneliness, with fleeting relationships and one-night stands taking the place of the committed partnership he desired, with him finding that nothing lived up to his fantasies. This led him to conclude that these fantasies were, quote, probably a contributing factor as to why I was never able to get emotionally close to people. My attraction was for ideal, theoretical people who presented a simplistic relationship free from the problems and complexities of real people. Locked in the loneliness of his fantasy world, Nilsen's only companions during Christmas 1978 was his loyal dog Bleep and a bottle of alcohol. And as the year came to a close, he would head out in search of human companionship. Join me as I delve into the night that changed Nilsen's life and the destruction that would lie in his wake. As I am writing this script, I'm in the process of editing the audio for the Robert Maudsley episode, in which I theorise that had he not become a serial killer, he may have ended up as one of the thousands of invisible and transient people who lived on the streets of London, struggling with mental health issues, addiction and homelessness. When Maudsley arrived in London, he became addicted to drugs and turned to sex work in order to pay for his fixes. As a young teenage boy, he was a vulnerable target for those who wished to take advantage of him. And had he been a teenage boy, coming to London just 5 years after his arrest, he would have fit the profile of some of Dennis Nilsen's victims. A transient soul, invisible to society, with their disappearance off the streets, unlikely to be noticed. By the time Nilsen had encountered his first victim, Robert Maudsley had murdered 2 inmates at Wakefield Prison, a place Nilsen would find himself just a few years later. Incidentally, the pair would briefly meet, albeit through the bars of a window, with Maudsley passing Nilsen a cigarette. I do wonder whether Nilsen would have been shown this kindness had Maudsley known who the man in the cell was. While Maudsley was already behind bars, Nilsen's own path to being a serial killer began on 30th of December 1978, when, already worse for drink and crippling loneliness, he headed out of his flat on Melrose Avenue and made his way to the Cricklewood Arms, a pub predominantly patronised by the Irish community. Ordering his first of many pints, Nilsen sat at the bar, where he became acquainted with a young Irish boy whom he engaged in conversation and shared several pints with until last orders were called, and the pair stepped out into the freezing winter air with snow slowly descending from the sky. Perhaps due to the wintry weather, or that he had missed the last bus of the night, with his inhibitions lowered by drink, the youth accepted Nilsen's invitation back to Melrose Avenue. But only one person would live to tell what occurred that night, with the following being Nilsen's account. Once within the flat, the drinking and conversation continued for a while longer, until the pair undressed and retired to bed. This was essentially the mattress Nilsen had pulled down from the raised platform upon which he normally slept. With the pair getting beneath the covers, they fell asleep, Nilsen claiming later that no sexual activity occurred. Waking before his guest, Nilsen recalled looking upon the youth, sleeping peacefully on his front. While his companion lay in a passive state, his host began to gently run his hands upon the boy's smooth, pale skin, becoming excited with each stroke, but also felt a surge of fear rushing as he realized that when the boy awoke, he would leave him, and Nilsen feared he would be, quote, plunged back into the despairing loneliness. He alleged that it was this fear which took over as he reached for a tie on the floor and began to strangle the sleeping boy, who was quickly awoken by the assault and began to struggle, causing the pair to roll off the mattress onto the floor. The youngster tried to fight back with all his strength, clawing at Nilsen's skin as the tie got tighter, and air became harder to obtain, causing the boy to fall into unconsciousness. Becoming aware of what he had done, a new fear washed over Nilsen. What would happen when the Irish youth woke up? How could he explain what he had done? And with these questions running through his mind, he decided he had to finish what he started. Retrieving a bucket filled with water from the kitchen, Nilsen draped the unconscious body over a chair and lowered the head into the container, where he held it as the bubbles began to form and then disappeared. He had claimed his first victim, an individual who would not be formally identified until 2005, when the Metropolitan Police visited Nilsen at Full Sutton Prison and showed him the photograph of a boy who had last been seen on December 30th, 1978. The image Nilsen was shown was that of 14-year-old Stephen Holmes, who, contrary to the stereotypes placed on Nilsen's victims, was neither transient or homosexual. He had been born on the 22nd of March 1964 and raised in West Hampstead in London by his Irish parents Frank and Kathleen, alongside his older sibling Debbie, whom he was very close to due to the pair being born just a year apart. In March 2024, on what would have been Stephen's 60th birthday, his friends and family came together to celebrate his life, with the Camden New Journal reporting on the occasion and interviewing those gathered who shared their memories of him. One such interviewee was Ms. Lee Coggan, who had been friends with Stephen since they were 7 years old, and remembered him being, quote, the studious one. We used to take the mickey out of him because he was like a mummy's boy, but he was still rebellious in his own way, adding that he was very, very intelligent. He used to always get his homework done on time. He would never have just gone off without phoning his mum. Miss Lee Coggan also reflected on who Stephen would have been, stating, I'm sure if he had lived to today, he would have made a great success at whatever he was going to do. He was that kind of person. Part of his bond with his sister Debbie was formed through their love of music, which they shared with their group of friends. His sibling would tell the Camden New Journal that one of their favourite places to be was, quote, the Bobby Socks in Willesden on Fridays, back in the 1970s, watching bands like the Flying Saucers, Matchbox, DJ 50's Flash, and It's Where We Met Our Tribe, a mix of all sorts of people, young and old. The loos left a lot to be desired, the floors were sticky, but we loved it. The Bobby Socks was located in a hall at the rear of the White Horse pub on Church Road in Willesden. Although it was demolished in the 1990s to make way for flats and a retail unit, the memories of those nights still linger on for those who spent their formative years there. As does the night that Stephen disappeared, having attended the venue with his friends. Miss Lee Coggan recalled that, quote, "He left early that night. I think it was just starting to snow. What we would learn later was he walked up to Cricklewood Broadway to wait for the bus. Yet unbeknownst to anyone at the time, instead of catching the bus, it is believed Stephen had headed into the Cricklewood Arms, where Nilsen alleged he was ordering drinks, which made him believe that the youth was of legal drinking age. However, there are suggestions that this was not the case, and that the bartender actually refused to serve Stephen, which some have speculated gave Nilsen an angle with which to approach the youngster. When Stephen failed to return home, his disappearance was reported to the police, but instead of deeming it as suspicious, he was treated as a runaway, much to the frustration of his parents, with his mother Kathleen turning to the Missing People charity for help. It was through them that her hopes of finding Stephen were kept alive, although she would pass away in 2002, not knowing what happened to him. Yet Debbie took time to praise the charity to the Camden New Journal for all the support they provided the family over the years. Contrary to the police's belief that Stephen was a runaway, he had actually been murdered the night he disappeared, and for over 2 decades he would be unidentified, although he could have been named sooner. In 1990, officers had visited Nilsen to see if he could recall anything about his unidentified victims, which may be linked with 2 missing person cases that dated back to the time he was active. One was a student from New Zealand, and the other was a boy called Holmes. However, the descriptions and names did not trigger any recollections with Nilsen, who could not even remember the name of his first victim. Unable to give them a positive identification, he asked if there was photos of the individuals, which might help jog his memory. A request the officers said they would chase up, and arranged a return visit, but this second interview never occurred. The reason for this failure was explained to Nilsen by the officers who visited him in 2005, with it being disclosed that after the original visit, a flood at the police station had destroyed or damaged certain files, causing the investigation to be halted. According to Nilsen, they also indicated that he was likely one of their only means of identifying the victims, explaining that most of the evidence collected from the scenes of the crimes had been destroyed, with the original investigators believing that they had garnered all the information they could, unaware that a couple of decades later, DNA testing may have been used to identify the human remains. Back in the early hours of December the 31st, 1978, having drowned Stephen, Nilsen placed the limp body on a chair, noting the water droplets falling from his victim's natural curls, which in life Stephen had tried hard to tame, and spent hours attempting to style his brown tresses into a quiff, to reflect the popular hairstyles of the musicians he admired. While he looked at the boy, Nilsen claimed he was shaking, as the realization of what he had done began to sink in. With the body still seated in the chair, he proceeded to make a cup of coffee and smoke several cigarettes as he considered what to do next. First, he cleared the room, then let Bleep in from the garden, but soon had to chastise her as the curious dog began to sniff at the deceased teenager sat motionless upon the chair, prompting Nilsen to grab his beloved dog by the neck and order her from the room. Alone with the body once more, he approached the chair and removed the tie from around the boy's neck. Then, through Stephen Holmes, Nilsen brought his fantasies into reality, performing the next part of what he later called the ritual, a process he carried out on most of his victims, with some slight variations. Recreating his fantasy of an old man carrying a young boy, Nilsen lifted the body and carried it into the bathroom, where he laid it in the tub and gently cleaned it, after which he toweled the body dry, and then laid the deceased upon the bed, where he explored the naked skin, of his passive partner before pulling the covers up over him. With the body tucked up as though it was slumbering, Nilsen spent the rest of the day pondering his next move, as his anxiety began to swell with concerns that the police may soon be at his front door to investigate the disappearance of his now deceased guest. As 1979 began, Nilsen considered what he was going to do with the body. He had no means of transportation, meaning he was unable to take the corpse to a remote spot in the country and bury it. Nor was he able to dig a grave in the garden, believing such activity may arouse suspicion, and he feared that Bleep may inadvertently unearth the remains. He initially settled on dissection, which would utilise the butchering skills he had acquired in the army. He went as far as purchasing a cooking pot and electric knife from an ironmonger's. Yet by the time he had completed the walk home from the shop, Nilsen had changed his mind. The electric knife would never be used in his crimes. Instead, it was utilised to carve the turkey at his work's Christmas party, before he gave it away to a colleague. Instead of dissection, he involved the body in his fantasies, dressing the corpse in white Y-fronts and a pair of socks. Nilsen took a bath and then got into bed beside the passive form, which he proceeded to caress and slowly undress. Initially he was aroused, but at the moment of penetration his excitement faded. Unable to copulate, his fantasy was shattered, and he deposited the body upon the floor, placing a curtain over it. He then went to sleep alone on the bed. He awoke the following day. No longer interested in the body beneath the curtain, he took Bleep for a walk, then sat watching television. It was only later that day that he decided to place the body beneath the floorboards, but he would have to wait another 24 hours for the rigor mortis to pass. For a week, the corpse resided in the dirty space beneath the floor, until curiosity caused Nilsen to disinter it. Seeing the filth that had formed upon the pale white skin, Nilsen carried the body to the bathroom where he bathed it. Although he could not have intercourse with the body, Nilsen did admit to masturbating over it on at least 2 occasions over the next couple of days. This would be another action he would repeat on future victims, but each time he would be compelled to clean the body afterwards. Momentarily he once again considered dissection, but claimed he, quote, couldn't do anything to spoil that marvellous body. And so, unable to further desecrate his victim's corpse, he would place it beneath the floorboards, where it remained for the next 7 months. In August 1979, Nilsen built a bonfire in his garden. Shielded by a 7-foot-high fence, and with the property next door vacant, he had some level of privacy, as he built a pyre around the body of Stephen Holmes, whom he had wrapped in bags, with rubber tyres being placed upon the fire in hopes they would disguise the smell. Once the flames had died down, Nilsen ground any remaining bones into dust, and raked them and the ashes into the soil, believing he had removed all traces of his crime. At the time of Nilsen's arrest, and the subsequent publication of Brian Master's book, Killing for Company, his first victim was listed as an unidentified male, believed to be roughly 18 or 19 years old, whose fate the police were unable to corroborate, having to trust that Nilsen's account of his first murder was factual. This was until Nilsen looked upon the image of 14-year-old Stephen Holmes 25 years later. In the months following the murder, Nilsen's anxiety regarding being caught began to subside, and he tried to convince himself that it had been a one-off event, brought about by loneliness and drink. He threw himself into his role at the job centre, where he was also the union representative, which added to his workload, but his abrasive attitude went against him when it came to being considered for promotion. After work, he tended to head to the known gay hotspots, where he continued his casual encounters, and the loneliness began to creep in once more. In October 1979, he met 19-year-old Andrew Ho, a student from Hong Kong. There are discrepancies between Nilsen's early accounts and his recollections in History of a Draining Boy, in which he claimed the encounter occurred in the lobby of the Regency Hotel, a location utilised by male sex workers, while other sources allege it was the Salisbury, a popular haunt for gay men. Incidentally, it was also used as a filming location for the film Victim, which dealt with the topic of homosexuality, and was the film Nilsen had watched alongside his brother Olaf and sister-in-law. Olaf's attitude towards the film was the catalyst which caused Nilsen to cut ties with his older brother. Regardless of where he met Andrew, Nilsen was now free from his brother's judgment and the years of repressing his sexuality. Although he had become more comfortable with it, he was still reserved when it came to certain sexual activities, and when Andrew accompanied Nilsen back to the flat and allegedly suggested bondage, his host turned him down. According to Nilsen's account, Andrew claimed he was struggling financially and so Nilsen offered to pay for his company, but reiterated that he was not interested in being intimate with him. However, his recollections change in History of a Drowning Boy, in which he alleges they were both naked in bed when he straddled Andrew and placed a tie around the 19-year-old's neck. Despite the bed being on a 6-foot-high platform, Andrew fought back. Leaping from the structure, he threw a candlestick at Nilsen, grabbing his claws and leaving. When the police arrived half an hour later, Nilsen would tell them the story he told police when he was arrested in 1983, and was subsequently published in Killing for Company in 1985. In that publication, which was formed using notes provided to the author, Brian Masters, by Nilsen, the killer claimed that he began to grow nervous regarding Andrew's true intentions, with him explaining later that gay men were often tricked into taking someone home, only to be robbed of their valuables or violently assaulted, with the perpetrator knowing that the incident was unlikely to be reported to the police. And if it was, the issue was not taken seriously, a complacency which Nilsen would find advantageous when it came to his own crimes. He alleged that as a precaution, he tied Andrew's feet together, and then decided to teach the student a lesson regarding the dangers of the life he was leading. He did so by placing a tie around the unsuspecting teenager's neck, purely to frighten him. The responding officers were faced with the situation of one person's word against another. Therefore, Nilsen was held while investigations and claims of attempted murder were carried out. Yet Andrew, an immigrant who at 19 years old was under the age of consent, was reluctant to press charges, fearing he may also be prosecuted. Nilsen would not be punished for any wrongdoings, meaning another opportunity to prevent the future killings were missed, with one officer on Andrew's case noting that Nilsen was, quote, dangerous, pathological even. But this, like previous concerns, would be filed away with no further action taken. As for the discrepancies in Nilsen's story, he would allege that when he was finally arrested for the murders in 1983, he was willing to confess to his crimes, but did not wish to disclose the details of his ritual. He saw this as a sacred part of his murders, through which he was able to act out the fantasies he had cultivated since his teenage years. There was a lot regarding Nilsen's case which was underreported, namely the disappearance of the men whose lives he stole, who, even when they were reported as missing, went unmentioned in the media. The one exception was 23-year-old Kenneth Ockenden, an engineering student whose family had moved from Britain to Canada when he was a child. In 1979 he had travelled to England to visit relatives and tour the country. Having already spent time with his cousin Ronald in Greenford on December 2, 1979, Kenneth planned to have a brief stop in London before going to visit his uncle in Carshalton in Surrey, after which he would catch a flight back to Canada to be with his parents for Christmas. He had started his day on the 3rd of December 1979, enjoying a breakfast at the Central Hotel in Argyle Street, after which he left the hotel and his belongings, except for his camera, intent on sightseeing and capturing images of London before leaving for his uncle's home. His failure to return to the hotel or contact his relative would result in the alarm being raised, and Kenneth was reported as missing. His disappearance would be the only one of Nilsen's victims to be reported in the newspapers, but his fate only came to light when Nilsen was arrested in 1983. In the interview room, the killer would provide the answers Kenneth's family had sought for the last 4 years, describing how he first encountered the Canadian in a West End bar. Subsequent inquiries would determine that this was a known meeting place for gay men, a detail the police seemingly failed to latch onto, with a narrative later fueled by the media that Kenneth was Nilsen's quote, straight mistake, despite the fact that the sexuality of many of his victims were unknown. However, intelligence gathered by Detective Inspector Roy Davis, who retraced Kenneth's ventures around the country, suggested that the missing man had on a number of occasions met men in bars and accompanied them back to their flat. This angle wasn't pursued, however, leaving D.I. Davis to question what possible clues may have been missed, with him recalling that the insinuation that Kenneth was gay was vehemently refuted by the 23-year-old's father, Roy. Whether Kenneth was gay or not can never be definitively answered, but there may have been other explanations for his actions. He may have accepted invitations to stay at someone's house simply because he had been offered a place to stay instead of a hostel or a hotel. It is also possible that as a tourist unfamiliar with London, he had entered the bar where he encountered Nilsen, oblivious that it was a known meeting place for gay men, and unaware that the tall, dark-haired Scotsman he left with would be his killer. With his companion's true nature disguised behind a facade of friendliness, Kenneth and Nilsen remained in the bar until around 3 p.m, at which time they left the establishment, with Kenneth accepting Nilsen's offer to be given a guided tour of London, taking in the major sights of the city, while the Canadian captured photographs as they went. As evening set in, Kenneth and Nilsen had a meal together, then headed back towards Melrose Avenue, with the slightly inebriated duo picking up some alcohol from an off-licence on the way. Once inside the dark confines of Nilsen's ground floor flat, the pair sat, talked and drank, with the Scotsman finding his companion's conversation engaging. But as the hours ticked by, his apprehension and fear grew, knowing that by the morning his new acquaintance would walk out of his life, leaving him alone once more. Although during his police interviews, Nilsen would not mention that he was afraid of being lonely. Instead, he alleged that he had become irritated that his guest had monopolised the use of the headphones, which shows once again that Nilsen is not a reliable narrator. Nilsen claimed that at roughly 1 or 2 a.m, he believed he wrapped the flex of the headphones around Kenneth's neck and began to strangle him, but the Canadian put up a fight, and as Nilsen dragged him across the floor in an attempt to regain control, Kenneth struggled. The frenzy riled up Bleep, who began to bark and scratch at the kitchen door. Afraid she would attract unwanted attention, Nilsen ceased his attack, leaving the motionless Kenneth on the floor, and let the dog out into the garden. Returning to the now deceased man on the living room floor, Nilsen calmly unwound the flex from his victim's neck, put on the headphones and sat back down on the chair to listen to music and consume more alcohol. He would later tell police that he did not recall the start of the attack, only realising what was happening when he was dragging Kenneth across the floor by the wire. As with his first victim, Nilsen went on to strip and bathe the body, before lying in bed with the deceased, kissing, caressing and embracing it as he fell asleep. Later, Nilsen would reassert his claims regarding all of his murders, that he never had intercourse with the body. When he awoke, Nilsen cleaned up the mess created during the night, and instead of leaving the body in his bed, he placed the remains in a wardrobe, where it remained until he returned from disposing of Kenneth's belongings and purchasing a Polaroid camera. The latter he would use to conduct a macabre photo shoot, which depicted the deceased as though he was still alive. These he would subsequently burn with the body. Over the preceding hours he enacted out his fantasies with the passive body, before depositing the corpse beneath the floorboards, a place he had discovered from his first kill was cold enough to help preserve the remains. Nilsen would remove the body from beneath the floor on at least 4 occasions. For a fortnight he recreated a scene of domesticity, with him treating the corpse as though it was still a living person, watching television and conducting conversations, although Nilsen would claim that this was simply him speaking his thoughts out loud, something people noted he would do, with Brian Masters noting that it often felt like Nilsen wasn't talking to you, but rather at you. After a couple of weeks, the body was returned to its hiding place, Nilsen bidding it a good night, leaving the remains of 23-year-old Kenny Fockenden to linger in the cold, dirty space, while the killer carried on with his life, even attending a works Christmas party within 2 weeks of the murder. Nilsen's confession regarding the murder of Kenny Fockenden was corroborated by the discovery of the Canadian's fingerprints on a London guidebook recovered from Nilsen's home. The Scotsman confessed that all the 23-year-old's other possessions had been destroyed, stating in notes to Brian Masters, "I destroyed the records which reminded me of him afterwards, smashed them with a spade and put them in the dustbin." 5 months into the new year, Nilsen returned from a union conference in Southport. Arriving at the train station in London, he would encounter his next victim, Martin Duffy, a vulnerable 16-year-old from Birkenhead who had travelled to London unbeknownst to his family. The last they had heard from him was when he packed his bags and stated he was moving roughly 4 miles away to New Brighton, but instead he inexplicably caught the train to London, something he allegedly had done frequently in the past, according to Brian Masters' book Killing for Company, in which he details the teenager's short and somewhat turbulent life. The publication disclosed that he was a troubled boy who had a habit of hitchhiking to London. The youngster would resort to sleeping rough on the streets of the capital, where he fortunately came to the attention of the homeless charity the Soho Project, who provided him food, shelter, and a ticket back home to Birkenhead. He would spend time in care, possibly due to his tendencies to run away from home, and attended a school for children with behavioural, social or emotional difficulties, with him also being assessed by a psychiatrist on numerous occasions, and being assigned a social worker. Brian Masters' book, Killing for Company, did provide an insight into Martin's life which very few of the media outlets covered, as many wrote him off simply as a homeless runaway. Yet the teenager, upon leaving school, returned to his family and briefly secured work as a salesman. He was still drawn to the bright lights of the capital, where, according to Masters, he frequented gay bars and became addicted to Valium. But upon the advice of his trusted London social worker, Martin headed back to Birkenhead and tried to focus on building a future for himself. Having met a girlfriend, Martin enrolled in a catering course, for which he was gifted a set of knives by his father, and in May 1980 he declared his plans to move to New Brighton. His life seemed to be heading in the right direction. So what prompted his decision to head to London on the 13th of May 1980 remains a mystery. Although it was speculated that a run-in with British Transport Police regarding an unpaid fare could have played a part. One individual who expressed surprise at Martin's choice was his London-based social worker, who could not understand why Martin had not reached out to him for help. Instead, the 16-year-old spent 4 days sleeping rough, close to Euston train station. Cold and hungry, he was approached by a kind Scotsman returning from a work trip, who offered him food and shelter. Stepping foot into the flat of Melrose Avenue, the youth was lightly relieved to be somewhere warm, hospitable and seemingly safe, and having enjoyed a meal, the boy retired alone to bed. Reenacting his attack on Stephen Holmes, Nilsen straddled Martin's slumbering form and began to strangle him with a ligature until the teenager was rendered unconscious. Leaving the motionless figure on the bed, Nilsen filled the kitchen sink, which he would use to drown his victim. Having stripped Martin, unlike his previous victims, Nilsen would join the deceased body in the bath, where he washed the teenager before drying him and laying the body on the bed. Nilsen claimed he then talked to him and mentioned that his body was the youngest looking I'd ever seen. I kissed him all over and held him close to me. Having fulfilled his fantasy, he placed the body in a wardrobe, where 2 days later he discovered it was bloated, causing him to lose interest, and he placed the corpse beneath the floor beside the remains of Kenny Fockenden. In reflecting on Martin's death, Nilsen stated, "I didn't see the act as killing Martin Duffy, but the necessary and compulsory act of removing his will and personality from his body, so that I could enjoy imbuing it with my own will and my own desire." This comment speaks of his detachment towards his victims, who to him are purely there to fulfill his own fantasies. This is apparent not only with how he viewed the murders, but also what he did with the individual's belongings, demonstrating his ability to disassociate the items from the person. He allegedly used Martin's knife set, which the teenager's father had proudly gifted to him, throwing them away when they became rusted. According to Martin's siblings, he had a more gruesome use for the knives, with them describing what Nilsen did with their brother's belongings after the murder. They stated, quote, "He took a left luggage ticket from Martin and went to Euston to get his briefcase. He used Martin's briefcase to take his sandwich to work in. He also took Martin's chef knives that had been a present from our dad, and he used the chef's knives to cut the victims up." It was revealed at court that one of Martin's treasured knives was used during the dissections, with the blade being used on its former owner, who had lain beneath the floorboards alongside Kenny Fockenden until the smell became too pronounced, prompting Nilsen's decision to dispose of the remains. Nilsen utilised Martin's knife to dissect both bodies, placing the parts in a suitcase which he then concealed in the garden shed, where they remained throughout the heat of summer, with him ultimately burning them on a bonfire. 3 months after murdering Martin, Nilsen would be on the prowl once more, and in August 1980 he met 26-year-old William Sutherland, a fellow Scotsman who had originally come from Edinburgh. Meeting William in a pub in Piccadilly Circus, Nilsen went through the usual routine of buying his new companion drinks, then invited him back to Melrose Avenue. However, he claimed he could not recall actually killing William, alleging that he woke up in the morning to, quote, "another body." This cold dismissal of his victim removed the humanity from a man, whom Nilsen would further disparage through comments he would make to the police, and which instigated the media's subsequent depiction of William. In Killing for Company, Brian Masters did cover some aspects of William's life, helping the reader to see him not just as a victim, but as a human being, who had his flaws, but was also a son, father, brother, and boyfriend. Like Martin Duffy, William seemed to have a troubled upbringing, but for different reasons, with his actions resulting in him being sent to an approved school, which was the equivalent of a young offenders institution, with it being claimed that he had also spent time in prison. The book alleged that he was a man who drank heavily and had tattoos on his limbs, as well as love and hate inked upon the knuckles of his hands. Some sources referred to him as a divorcee, yet he seemed to have found love again, as just prior to his murder he had been living in the Muir House district of Edinburgh with his girlfriend and young child. William had travelled to London to seek employment as a chef, yet his family were never far from his mind, with him sending his mother letters so frequently that they knew something was wrong when his correspondence stopped abruptly. His loved ones would learn about William's demise at the same time news crews were covering the fingertip search police were undertaking after Nilsen's arrest. In 2013, his brother Seaton recalled the moment they were notified of William's fate, stating, "My mum was watching the news on TV. They were digging up Nilsen's garden, looking for bodies. There was a knock at the door, and it was detectives to say they had found parts of Billy, under Nilsen's floorboards. There was a piece of skin with a tattoo on it, and his false teeth, which forensics used to confirm his identity. The whole family were in shock. Further heartache would be brought upon the family when news of Nilsen's confessions began to leak out to the press. Not only had their loved one's killer referred to William as just another body, but he claimed while in the interview room that William had not only been sleeping rough in London, but had turned to sex work to pay for food and lodgings. This suggestion is one his family vehemently refutes, with Seton Sutherland defending his brother's memory during the same 2013 interview. He stated, "One of our brothers is actually gay," and laughed at the idea of Billy being homosexual. He was the biggest womanizer going. He had been married and gone on to have a son with another girlfriend. Knowing Billy, he probably thought Nilsen was being friendly towards him, because they were both Scots. Mr. Sutherland continued by denouncing the narrative, which even in 2013 was still being reported, that his brother was a sex worker, with him saying, "I hate the fact that every time I search on the internet for Billy Sutherland, which is also the name of my son, that a picture of my brother comes up with the words male prostitute next to a photograph of Nilsen. I'm angry that's how my brother is remembered." The loss of William naturally devastated his family. His father, who had been a marine engineer, was unable to continue working, while his mother fell into a deep depression, which she fought until the day she died, likely not helped by the manner in which her son's memory was being besmirched. The culture of intolerance which existed at the time meant that most victims who were identified received similar treatment to William, with them being labelled as homeless or homosexual, as though this made them unimportant. These labels only exemplified why people who were living on the streets or were gay existed on the fringes of society, making them even more vulnerable. While gay men were still reluctant to openly reveal their sexuality due to prejudice, forcing them to congregate in places where they could socialise safely, hence the incarnation of famous gay villages like the one found in Manchester, homeless men became invisible figures on the streets of London, people passing them by without giving a moment's thoughts to who they were, where they had come from, and where they would be spending the night. Forced to exist on the edge of society, both groups were vulnerable. Intolerance could lead to violence against a gay man, whose attacker felt they were easy targets, with it being unlikely an assault would be reported, and if it was, the same prejudice existed within the police force, who may not investigate the complaint completely, with Nilsen experiencing this firsthand. He had witnessed how the police had handled people in their custody during his time in the force, but also endured it himself in 1980, when he was arrested for being drunk and disorderly. Nilsen was taken to the holding cells at Kilburn Police Station, where he alleges he was beaten up and urinated on. Appearing in court the following morning, still dressed in his urine-soaked clothes, and bearing the bruises from his assault, he stated to the magistrate that the charge against him was false, claiming it was born out of, quote, some animosity from an ex-colleague, before proceeding to detail the abuse he had suffered while in custody. Years later, Nilsen stated that his experiences pertaining to the police and their handling of individuals in custody was partially the reason why he was cooperative when it came to confessing to his crimes. The gay community were not alone when it came to how society treated them, with the cold, dark streets of London posing a danger to the thousands of homeless men who dwelt there, with many of them having cut ties with their past, and their transient lives meaning when they did disappear, their absence went unnoticed. It is likely this is the reason some of Nilsen's victims went unidentified, with him committing a spate of murders from September 1980 until April 1981, with only his accounts of the crimes and his descriptions of the victims to aid in identification. The first of these attacks occurred in September 1980, with him claiming the life of a man he described as an Irish labourer, who, like his previous victims, Nilsen met in a pub, plied with drinks, and invited the stranger back to Melrose Avenue. where the man was killed and placed under the floorboards. The vague details regarding this individual speak to two possibilities. The culture of secrecy and promiscuity within the gay scene meant that individuals rarely shared too much information regarding themselves, working on finding only first names, which in a one-night stand could easily be forgotten. The reluctance to share information was intended to protect them, with some fearing that in the wrong hands, this could be used against them, potentially ending relationships and careers. Likewise, those who lived on the streets rarely shared personal details, often going by nicknames, with many running from their past or indiscretions. This veil of secrecy within both communities was intended to protect, but to Nilsen it proved advantageous. It removed an aspect of the person's identity, and allowed him to separate the individual from the act of killing them. It is worth noting that the victims he recalls the most are the ones who did share details of their lives, or he spent a prolonged period of time with. For instance, Kenneth Ockenden, whom Nilsen alleged he considered a friend, despite spending less than 24 hours with him, and claimed that he was affected by the Canadian's death. The other possibility is that Nilsen's claim in History of a Drowning Boy is true, and he made up some of his victims, including the Irish labourer, hence why the details regarding his life and death lack any detail. The other victims he claimed were fabricated was a man he referred to as a long-haired hippie, whom he allegedly killed either in November or December of 1980, but he provided very few details regarding the circumstances. And while another made-up man, dubbed the English skinhead, was given a more detailed backstory. Nilsen alleged he met the skinhead at a food stall in Leicester Square, and he left the body on display in his bedroom for a day before it was secreted under the floor. Regarding these victims, Nilsen claimed they were created in order to, quote, complement the continuity of evidence, explaining that during the drive to the police station immediately after his arrest, he had been asked how many people he had killed, with him flippantly replying 15. Although in his autobiography he claimed it was actually 12, and he was forced to invent some to be consistent with the original figure. While these victims are debatable due to the lack of details, Nilsen did provide information regarding others, but sadly they have never been identified. Amongst them was a man Nilsen claimed was a sex worker, whom he met in the Salisbury Arms in October 1980. Describing the man as being 20 to 30 years old, of slim build, just under 6 foot tall, and of Filipino or Mexican descent. A month after claiming this individual's life, Nilsen met his next victim, who had been sleeping rough in the doorway of the property on Charing Cross Road. The man, whom Nilsen estimated was in his 20s, was thin, pale, and was missing several teeth, with Nilsen commenting that he felt this individual's life had been, quote, one of long suffering. He took the homeless man back to Melrose Avenue and killed him as he slept, recalling that the emaciated man's legs made a cycling motion during the attack. Regarding this murder, Nilsen stated, his legs were lifted like he was riding a bicycle. It was as easy as taking candy from a baby. I thought I was doing him a favour. I had the impression his life had been one of suffering. In January 1981, he would claim the life of an 18-year-old, but the details regarding his demise are lacking, with Nilsen only able to recall that the teenager was a blue-eyed Scotsman. The following month, Nilsen met a man in his early 20s from Belfast. With the pubs already closed, he took the 5'9", dark-haired man back to Melrose Avenue, where the Irishman was strangled and disappeared beneath the floorboards. When considering the nature of these descriptions, it is easy to understand why these individuals have not been identified. The scarcity of details or the vague nature of their physical descriptions left police with very little to work with, leaving so many unanswered questions, not only regarding who they were, but where they had come from and what had caused them to be in London. Tragically, these unnamed souls are as forgotten in death as they were in life, with so many reports referring to them simply as the unidentified or the bodies under the floorboards. But they were people who had a life, and hopefully somewhere they had loved ones who had never stopped looking for them. One individual whose life was claimed by Nilsen had little in the way of family ties. Malcolm Barlow was just 11 years old when his mother died, leaving him and his sister orphaned. For a while Malcolm's older sibling tried to look after him, but his complex needs made it hard for her to give him the care he needed. Aside from having epilepsy, Malcolm also suffered from behavioural and mental issues, which made him unruly and hard to manage. Likely worsened not only by the loss of his mother, but the decision to remove him from the only family he had, to be placed among the 87,377 other children in the care of local authorities in England and Wales as of March 1971. Arguably, Malcolm could be seen as a representation of the system's failure to provide sufficient support for those leaving care, as he ultimately became a nomadic character travelling the country, either sleeping rough or finding refuge in a hostel. By the time Malcolm was 23 years old, he was said to be a compulsive liar who, having a low IQ, had developed some street smarts. He had turned to sex work for money, and it was alleged he occasionally resorted to blackmailing the men he slept with it also being claimed that Malcolm had also apparently learned to induce seizures to garner sympathy. He had not completely fallen through the cracks, however. He had limited contact with a probation officer and acquired medication through the NHS to manage his epilepsy. He also had a keen understanding of how to claim benefits through the Department of Health and Social Security. Yet overall, Malcolm Barlow was still a vulnerable and friendless young man when he encountered Nilsen on the 17th of September 1981. It was 7:30 in the morning when Nilsen stepped out of the front door of 195 Melrose Avenue, intent on heading to work. Instead, his attention was drawn to a figure slumped against a wall just a short distance away. Concerned, Nilsen inquired about the man's welfare, and the individual advised him that his epilepsy medication had caused his legs to give way. Allegedly, Nilsen helped the man back to the flat, where the bodies of at least 5 men lay beneath their feet, as the killer aided his guest onto a chair and made Malcolm a cup of coffee. While his guest sat sipping on the warm beverage, Nilsen headed to the nearby phone box and called an ambulance, which took Malcolm off to the hospital, while Nilsen headed off to work, satisfied by his role as a good Samaritan, and believing that was the last he would see of Malcolm Barlow. Yet the following day Nilsen returned home from work to find a familiar figure sitting outside waiting for him. It emerged that earlier that day Malcolm had discharged himself from hospital, headed to claim his benefits from the Department of Health and Social Security, then made his way to Melrose Avenue, presumably intending to thank Nilsen for his kindness. Nilsen invited the 23-year-old into the ground floor flat, where he cooked him a meal, after which Nilsen began drinking, claiming he was reluctant to give alcohol to his guest, through concerns it may interfere with the man's epileptic medication. However, Malcolm reassured him that a little bit wouldn't do any harm. But having only consumed a small amount, Malcolm fell asleep, leaving him at the mercy of Nilsen, who claimed that when he attempted to rouse the slumbering man, he discovered his guest was unresponsive. Nilsen had the option to call for an ambulance like he had done the day before, but instead he manually strangled the 23-year-old. Not only was the manner in which he had met Malcolm different from his previous victims, but the manner in which he treated his body diverged from his now established ritual. No bathing or role play took place. Instead, Malcolm was placed in the cupboard beneath the kitchen sink, due to the space under the floor having reached capacity. By all accounts, the house on Melrose Avenue was an old, poorly maintained property, with worn carpets, old furniture and crumbling interiors, as exemplified by a home video recording showing the aftermath of the ceiling in the flat collapsing, causing plaster and masonry to rain down on Nilsen, who was sleeping in one of the 2 single beds, which were positioned either side the French doors which led out into the private garden. At the opposite end of the room, just a few feet away from the foot of the beds, sat the kitchenette, comprising of a sink, cooker, and a small worktop. It was into this space Dennis had moved in with David Galashan, when their relationship was still fresh and filled with hope. They bought a black and white puppy named Bleep, who became Nilsen's most loyal companion. As the state of the flat deteriorated, so did Nilsen's relationship with David, and when it ended, Nilsen spiralled further into drink and promiscuity. With David Galashan gone, Nilsen made changes to the flat, including constructing a 6-foot-high platform which became his bed, and from recollections of police officers who visited the home, he had painted the walls black. At work, Nilsen was seen as an abrasive figure who tended to talk at people rather than with them, and some recall that he did not seem to register when someone became disinterested in the topic of conversation. Nilsen rarely socialised with his colleagues either. Although he did attend the work's Christmas party, he was less likely to join them for a drink after a day's work was done. His abrasive nature also made him a difficult tenant. He had made himself familiar with what his rights were, and was not afraid to voice his opinions when he felt he was being treated poorly. Yet after David Galashan's departure from the property, Nilsen felt that the landlord was making a concerted effort to force him out of the flat, believing that the plan was to have a vacant home, which they could renovate to increase their earnings. This he felt was proven when he arrived home to find his and another tenant's flat had been broken into, their belongings vandalised, causing Nilsen to throw the damaged furniture into the garden. He would also be surprised by his colleagues, who, having heard about the incident, raised £85 to help him replace the items. The police were called regarding the break-in, and 2 officers arrived to survey the damage and make a report, with them unknowingly standing over the spot where Nilsen's bodies had been concealed. They would not be the only ones who would be in the flat, unaware of what lay beneath their feet, with one of Nilsen's only friends, Martin Hunter Craig, recalling his visit to the flat, where he would occasionally spend the night with Nilsen, whom he found, quote, wasn't a bad-looking man, quite educated. It was quite good to talk to him. The flat, however, contrasted with Nilsen's usual smart and well-kept appearance, with Martin remembering that the property was in a dilapidated state, with a pungent odour perforating from what he believed was likely damp, dry rot or animal smells, with him unable to conceive the notion that the stench was caused by the decaying bodies beneath his feet. Martin recalled it smelt awful. It really smelt nasty, but nothing other than this really stood out. Through his friendship with Nilsen, Martin got a glimpse of a man whom, behind the sometimes quiet and abrasive nature, was an intelligent and funny individual who was slow to anger. But even Martin was not privy to the true character of Nilsen, and in the years after Nilsen's arrest, his old friend was left questioning what signs he may have missed. On one occasion, after Nilsen was sentenced, Martin spoke to him looking for answers, only to find his friend more interested in talking about the weather and other events, seemingly unremorseful and unfazed by his actions. Martin did get one answer from Nilsen, which would only serve to haunt him, recalling that the Scotsman had once asked him to move in with him, but Martin had refused. Later, questioning his decision, he asked the now imprisoned Nilsen what would have happened had he moved in, with the answer being that they would have been happy, with the prisoner insinuating that the murders would not have occurred. This left Martin with misplaced guilt, feeling that had he made different choices or spotted the signs, no one would have died at the hands of his friend. Yet could Martin's presence have prevented Nilsen's murderous nature from emerging, or would their relationship only have served to delay it? A question which is impossible to answer, with the reality being that beneath the floor of Melrose Avenue and under the kitchen sink, Nilsen's secrets were concealed, and by August 1981, with tensions with his landlord mounting, Nilsen was offered £1,000 as compensation for the problems he had experienced while living at the flat, and new accommodation in Muswell Hill. After viewing the new flat, he accepted the terms and agreed to move out of Melrose Avenue by the end of October. He had at least 6 issues he needed to contend with, in the form of his victims, who were in varying states of decay and now required immediate attention. Unable to transport or bury them, Nilsen opted to burn the remains, but realised he would need to dissect the bodies first, something he had been reluctant to do, yet conceded that the process was purely for practical purposes and he derived no pleasure or satisfaction from it. In fact, he found the only way he could carry out the deed was with the aid of alcohol, which allowed him to utilise his butchering skills, and once he had completed his task, he now had smaller, less conspicuous pieces to burn on the fire. In his autobiography, History of a Draining Boy, Nilsen addresses some of the misconceptions which have arisen regarding his dismembering the bodies, with him denying that he fed the remains to Bleep, although he did admit the thought had occurred to him, yet he decided against it because he, quote, did not want her to acquire a taste for human flesh. With regards to cannibalism, Nilsen claimed there was no chance that would have occurred. His statement regarding the matter could be perceived as an insult to his victims, with him stating he was, quote, unsure of the purity of the meat. Elaborating further, he added that it was, quote, unlikely it would have passed for human consumption by a meat inspector. He also addressed the moral aspect of consuming human remains, stating, I did not think their flesh was fit or suitable for human consumption. Just 2 days before he was due to vacate, the pyre was lit and drew the attention of unsuspecting children, who delighted in seeing the blaze, with Nilsen cautioning them not to get too close. Once the fire had died, Nilsen repeated the process of crushing any remaining bones and raking over the soil. He also checked the house to ensure nothing had been missed, yet he was not as thorough as he believed, with the police finding over 1,000 bone fragments within the garden of Melrose Avenue and on the patch of wasteland beyond, with further remains discovered within the flat itself. However, suspicion could have fallen on Nilsen sooner, as when he had dissected the bodies, he placed the entrails into a carrier bag and took Bleep for a walk to nearby Gladstone Park, where he left the bag on the side of the road. It was allegedly picked up by a biology student, who, suspicious of the contents, handed it over to a Willesden police station, where it was decided that it was animal remains and disposed of. Nilsen admits he had been sloppy in his handling of this potentially incriminating evidence. Blaming his drunken state, he claimed he left bloody fingerprints on the bag, meaning had the police investigated the remains further, they would have determined they were human, not animal, and could have traced it back to him, missing another opportunity to stop him. With the police none the wiser to the serial killer operating on the streets of London, and Nilsen believing that having burned his victims' remains, he had sufficiently covered his tracks, he moved out to Melrose Avenue at the end of October 1981, perceiving the move to his new flat at Cranley Gardens as a fresh start. He hoped to leave the crimes of his past behind him, but he could not escape his urges. Thank you for listening to It's Murder Up North. Join me next time as I delve into the stories of Nilsen's final victims, those who survived, and the aftermath of his arrest.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.